Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show. Mika Brzezinski is the wife of Joe Scarborough, former Republican congressman from Florida, and she is the co-host with Joe Scarborough of Morning Joe on MSNBC. And she is very unhappy with President Donald Trump. According to the Daily Mail, Twitter founder Jack Dorsey will speak to MSNBC host Mika Brzezinski, who is demanding Donald Trump is banned from the platform after accusing her husband and co-host Joe Scarborough of murder, she revealed Wednesday. She tweeted that she was going to have a call with Dorsey and Twitter's general counsel, Sean Edgett, after Trump on Wednesday once again demanded an investigation into the death of one of Scarborough's interns. Guys like low-rating psycho Joe Scarborough are allowed to walk the streets? Open cold case, he tweeted in a comparison to his disgraced long-term fixer Roger Stone. Brzezinski blasted back on Twitter after their show that she was writing to Dorsey, seeking to have Trump banned for violating the site's policies on false accusations. I will be reaching out to head of Twitter about their policies being violated every day by President Trump. Twitter need to know why Trump is not banned. She later tweeted that Dorsey and the company's general counsel would be speaking to her. Dorsey has never previously engaged publicly with calls for Trump to be banned from the platform. At one point, is Twitter a part of this? She tweeted, take down Trump's account, the whole world be safer, retweet if you agree. And Trump's claim centers on the death of Lori Klausutis, 28, who interned for Scarborough's congressional office in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. She died in 2001 at the office after falling and hitting her head. Doctors ruled her death an accident as a result of an undiagnosed heart arrhythmia. But a conspiracy theory that she had been romantically involved with Scarborough and that her death was not an accident has swirled and has been fanned repeatedly in recent weeks by Trump. Scarborough was not at the office at the time of Klausutis' death, and the Washington Post gave the claim 4 Pinocchios its worst rating. Yes, fact-checking. You see, Donald Trump did not say that this was a cold case. What he was suggesting was that it should be a cold case. Last Tuesday, even though Trump often asserts he doesn't watch Morning Joe or MSNBC in general, it took only 20 minutes from Scarborough attacking him for him to launch a Twitter assault against Scarborough, calling him a murderer. Well, no, he did not call him a murderer. He suggested he is a murderer, which is not quite the same thing. Twitter's treatment of Trump has become a lightning rod for criticism of the platform and a dilemma for Dorsey and its executives. A series of tweets which would appear to be in the breach of policies against fake news, insults, and harassment have been the subject of complaints. But Twitter introduced a public interest exemption which applies to political leaders and allows their tweets to go beyond its policies. It also introduced restrictions on misleadingly edited material, with a Trump tweet falling. This is the Daily Mail, and the stories are poorly written, like pretty much all of the stories on the internet, and there is a word or words missing from this. So, Mika was very upset that a number of people, I suppose you could say on the right, responded to one of her demands with the insult, "Okay, Karen." And it was very, very amusing to look at the replies to a video of Sean Hannity, which she sent to all of these people who had tweeted "Okay, Karen" at her. And she was, as the kids like to say, savagely ratioed in the comments. To give you an idea of the kind of thinking Mika Brzezinski indulges in, 22 hours ago, she retweeted a tweet from Karine Jean-Pierre. I'm thrilled to announce that I will be joining the Biden campaign as a senior advisor. This is the most important general election in generations, and I could just not sit this election out. I look forward to doing this work with Joe Biden and his team. Mika's response was, best news all day, 6 exclamation marks. I looked up Karine Jean-Pierre, and she is a Haitian lesbian, which I'm sure will definitely help Joe Biden in trying to claw back enough of those people who voted for the Joe Lunch Pails, who voted for Trump in Florida and Michigan, and such that Biden could take the election. But it's just too funny seeing this. Oh yes, Raheem Kassam, who was tweeted at by Mika Brzezinski, he included a clip of Mika seeming to be very, very friendly with Trump not that long ago, and stepping right up to him and stroking his hair over and over again. Someone tweeted to Morning Mika something embarrassing from the sainted Dr. Anthony Fauci from the end of January. Quote, but it's something that we as public health officials need to take seriously. It isn't something the American public needs to worry about or be frightened about, because we have ways of preparing and screening of people coming in from China. And we have ways of responding, like we did with this one case in Seattle, Washington, who had traveled to China and brought back the infection. It's a very, very low risk to the United States, Fauci said during an interview with radio show host John Katsamatidis. And I guess this is another example here of what we've been hearing, that, oh, we didn't have very much data, but we decided to make definitive pronouncements despite our lack of data. Now, apparently, there is more data, and so more definitive pronouncements can come from our elite, from our experts. And anyway, so Mika demanded a meeting, or at least a call, with 2 of the top Twitter worthies, and she gets one. I rather much doubt that Twitter is going to start removing Trump tweets or removing his account, in which case he would go to Gab and take an awful lot of people with him. And if people wanted to follow what the President of the United States has to say online, well, then they would have to go to Gab, and Twitter would not like that at all. Actually, neither would the elite. So I want to talk about Governor Death, Andrew Cuomo of New York. This is a catastrophe, right? COVID-19, the greatest pandemic of our time, of many generations. It is a matter of the utmost seriousness. We should all be panicked and downcast, or downcast and panicked. Let's see, trending video, CNN's Chris Cuomo pokes fun at brother Governor Andrew Cuomo's nose after taking virus tests during his daily briefing. And Chris Cuomo is waving about a gigantic Q-tip, this sort of Bobby Bittman level of humor. Again from the Mail, 23,000 dead New Yorkers, and it's keeping up with the Cuomos. Chuckling brothers are slammed for CNN nasal swab joke while death toll mounts, and the governor keeps silent on reopening. During Wednesday's episode of Cuomo Primetime, the governor recounted how he was tested for coronavirus on live TV during his daily press briefing on Sunday, leading his brother to joke he had a big nose and required a baseball bat-sized nasal swab for a test. But not all viewers were laughing over the brotherly banter. The View host, Meghan McCain, did you know that she was the daughter of the late Senator John McCain. And remarkable, isn't it? And it's quite admirable of her that she doesn't attempt to make anything of it or to mention it, I don't know, nearly every day. Anyway, Meghan McCain said, "I'm not sure I'm going to ever be able to buy a crib or baby clothes for my first child in a store. Most of my friends are jobless, petrified, and dealing with depression." And Janice Dean lost both her mother and father-in-law to COVID within a week of each other. "This is hilarious, guys," she added sarcastically. Other conservatives joined in the criticism of the duo for their jokes. Let's see. Janice Dean said Cuomo is auditioning for a new comedy show with his brother Chris on CNN. Of course, the governor didn't address the thousands of deaths from COVID-19 in nursing homes in New York. Some Twitter users came to the Cuomo's defense. Yes, so these two take the 90K dead very seriously, as do the rest of us. They also know that they and we also have to have a laugh, because otherwise this country will end up in a state of depression. There's nothing wrong with a little bit of comedy relief. Lighten up, one Twitter user said. These are the same people who have been screaming at Donald Trump for weeks, for months now, because he is not staring down at the floor and mumbling and appearing to be overcome with events. Okay, a devastating opinion piece about Governor Death from Miranda Devine of the New York Post. In his daily coronavirus briefing on Wednesday, Governor Andrew Cuomo was as haughty and boastful as ever. The difference this time was that the Albany press pack didn't give him a free pass. It's incredible how highly he rates himself when he has presided over the most COVID deaths of any state in the nation by far, 22,976 as of Wednesday, some 7 times more than California, which is a state many times bigger than New York, 11 times more than Florida, which has the same population. New York still hasn't come to grips with why that is. The disparity is not a random act of God, as the governor would have us believe. He bears at least some culpability. He was slower to respond to the threat of the virus, and then he compounded that error with the unforgivably callous act of forcing nursing homes to admit COVID-positive patients, a death sentence for other residents as the infection spread like wildfire. And yet, not a trace of worry do we see on Cuomo's tanned face. There is no remorse, just buck passing. Wednesday, for instance, he blamed President Trump for the nursing home deaths. The chutzpah is astonishing. But at least he faced tough questions about a potential federal probe into his March 25th directive to nursing homes. "I have refrained from politics," he said laughably. But anyone who wants to ask, why did the state do that with COVID patients in nursing homes? It is because the state followed President Trump's CDC guidance, so they should ask President Trump. Cuomo even tried to claim that the more than 5,500 deaths connected to nursing homes in New York was a better toll per capita than most other states. But the State Department of Health seems to have fudged at the death toll, admitting it does not count nursing home residents who ended up dying in hospital of the coronavirus, so the real numbers are much higher. Asked about this convenient accounting, Cuomo returned to Trump. The state followed President Trump's CDC guidance. No numbers were changed. Well, this was not Donald Trump's guidance. This was the Centers of Disease Control guidance. It was not mandatory. The state CDC said that it would be possible to do this if proper precautions were taken, and there was a list of protocols, and this was not followed in New York State, just like it was not followed in New Jersey. A reporter pointed out that Cuomo has shown a willingness to thwart President Trump at other times. Why not on his March 25th nursing home directive? Good question, which Cuomo couldn't answer. Instead, he switched to blaming the nursing homes. In retrospect, he was asked, "Do you think that was a bad decision? Do you think it contributed to the death toll?" "No," Cuomo said, "because you have to be saying the nursing homes were wrong in accepting COVID-positive patients. It is Kafkaesque. First, he orders nursing homes to obey a directive with his name emblazoned at the top of the page, quote, all nursing homes must comply with the expedited receipt of residents returning from hospitals. No resident shall be denied readmission or admission to the nursing home solely on a confirmed or suspected diagnosis of COVID-19. The nursing homes were prohibited in that March 25th directive, even from COVID testing discharged patients. But now that the policy has blown up in his face, he blames those same nursing homes for doing what he ordered them to do. We always had alternative beds. Any nursing home could just say, I can't handle a COVID person. Yet in April, he told a reporter at a press conference that the nursing homes don't have the right to object. His reversal of the directive on Mother's Day was a tacit acknowledgement of wrongdoing, as was the legal indemnity for nursing homes that he reportedly slipped into the state budget in late March. The terrible thing about Cuomo is he has the appearance of being everything he's not. He is a facsimile of a take-charge alpha male who stands up and takes responsibility. In reality, he behaves like a dithering, vain, deceitful bully. He appears to be a moral Catholic family man who talks about his days as an altar boy and expresses concern for the sanctity of life. Quote, to me, I say the cost of a human life is priceless, period, he philosophized one day while trying to justify his decision to keep everyone in lockdown. But it's not true. He doesn't think every human life is precious at all. Last year, he pushed for euthanasia legislation and gloated about signing into law the state's late-term abortion laws. He even had one World Trade Center lit in hot pink in an obscene celebration of death. And didn't he just tell us breezily last week, as the heat from his nursing home fiasco dialed up, older people, vulnerable people are going to die from this virus that is going to happen despite whatever you do. Well, he made sure of it. We knew from the start of the pandemic that the frail elderly were most at risk. Florida, with its big retired population, moved early to protect nursing homes. A mistake is one thing, but Cuomo's lack of remorse or self-doubt is chilling. I feel very good about how exhaustive I've been in communicating, he boasted on Wednesday. It is true he has been communicating exhaustively. His Love Gov routine, joking around with his brother on CNN and strutting his stuff as New York's most eligible bachelor, has done wonders for his approval ratings, but it doesn't save the people who died distressing deaths unnecessarily and alone in nursing homes that he knew could barely cope at the best of times. You know, this arrogance runs in the Cuomo family. Older listeners might remember that Andrew and Chris's father, Mario, who was also governor of New York, had designs of becoming president of the United States. And despite being a proponent of abortion, he trotted out the whole Catholic thing. That's, I suppose, the best position to be in for a politician in the United States and Canada, to be a Catholic in name only. I remember the media was quite keen on Mario Cuomo, and in one of the profiles, a loving profile that I read about him back in the 80s, it told a story about him from high school, which was supposed to tell us, I suppose, just how clever he was. The story goes like this. Cuomo was walking down the hall of his Catholic high school, and he was holding a cigarette. And a priest came up to him and said, Mr. Cuomo, you know that smoking is not allowed on school property. And Cuomo said, but Father, this cigarette isn't lit. You see, the right answer is, I'm sorry, Father, I won't do it again. But Mario Cuomo decided that he was going to try and make the priest look foolish. I remember reading that and thought, I do not like this man, not one little bit. So let's see if there's anything going on in the chat. Okay, appears to be. Something about bagpipe. Okay. Glib Medley says, none of that stuff in my hood, just an ice cream truck. Also, I haven't heard any ambulance sirens like I was hearing a month ago. William Hicks says, but did she, that would be Mika, sniff Trump's hair? Glib Medley answering the question about the music played by the ice cream truck. Nope, not Turkey in the Straw either. A generic thing I've heard before. Okay. Nice SCTV reference, says David Wright. Manfred von Thistlebaum says, be worried if the ice cream truck is driven by a clown. You know, when I heard Kramer talking on Seinfeld about how much he was afraid of clowns, I thought, I don't like clowns either. I've always found them to be sinister. And then I found out that apparently this is a widely held feeling. A lot of people who don't like clowns. And I suppose that number increased after we learned about John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer. Glib Medley. When Mario Cuomo ran against Ed Koch, I believe it was Andrew who came up with the slogan, vote for Cuomo, not the homo. Yes, you are absolutely right about that. But of course, Andrew Cuomo is going to get a pass for that because he is one of the good guys. Carl Quintanilla tweets, JP Morgan has a devastating piece arguing that infection rates have declined, not increased in states where lockdowns have ended, quote, even after allowing for an appropriate measurement lag, unquote. And I'm looking at the chart, and it is pretty impressive. The same goes for various countries, adds JP Morgan. This means that the pandemic and COVID-19 likely have its own dynamics unrelated to often inconsistent lockdown measures that were being implemented. And this is exactly the claim made by General Ben Israel in Israel. More from JP Morgan. In the absence of conclusive data, these lockdowns were justified initially, but millions of lives were being destroyed with little consideration that lockdowns might not only cause economic devastation, but potentially more deaths than COVID-19 itself. Demagogues will be tempted to use COVID-19 to blame immigrants, people of a different race, or use the pandemic as a pretext to intensify geopolitical tensions. We will closely monitor how these risks evolve, but at this point, we see them as potential tail risks. The initial response of the administration was to downplay the risk of the COVID-19 epidemic. However, since then, this simplistic thesis changed significantly. The administration shifted to forecasting a larger negative impact, setting the stage for them to outperform, shifting the pandemic blame to China and the WHO, and shifting the blame for economic pain to large blue states that are perceived to be slowing down the reopening of the economy. Indeed, allowed economic activity across the country is now largely following partisan lines. Indeed, it is. So, Ross Clark in The Spectator today. One of the great unknowns of the COVID-19 crisis is just how deadly the disease is. Much of the panic dates from the moment in early March when the World Health Organization published a mortality rate of 3.2%, which turned out to be a crude case fatality rate, dividing the number of deaths by the number of recorded cases, ignoring the very large number of cases which are asymptomatic or otherwise go unrecorded. The Imperial College modeling, which has been so influential on the government, assumed an infection fatality rate, IFR, of 0.9%. This was used to compute the infamous prediction that 250,000 Britons and 2.2 million Americans would die unless the government abandoned its mitigation strategy and adopted instead a policy of suppressing the virus through lockdown. Imperial later revised its estimate of the IFR down to 0.66%, although the March 16th paper, which predicted 250,000 deaths, was not updated. In the past few weeks, a slew of serological studies estimating the prevalence of infection in the general population has become available. This allowed Professor Ioannidis of Stanford University to work out the IFR in 12 different locations. They range between 0.02% and 0.5%, although Ioannidis has corrected those raw figures to take account of demographic balance and come up with estimates between 0.02% and 0.4%. The lowest estimates came from Kobe, Japan, and the Wies in northern France with an IFR of 0.04%. The highest were in Geneva, a raw figure of 0.5%, and Gangelt in Germany, 0.28%. The usual caveats apply. Most studies to detect the prevalence of SARS-CoV-2 virus in the general population remain unpublished and have not yet been peer-reviewed. Some are likely to be unrepresentative of the general population. The WEES study in particular was based on pupils, teachers, and parents in a single high school, which was known to be a hot spot of COVID-19 infection. At the other end of the table, Geneva has a relatively high age profile, which is likely to skew its death rate upwards. But it is noticeable how all these estimates for IFR are markedly lower than the figures thrown about a couple of months ago, when it was widely asserted that COVID-19 was a whole magnitude worse than flu. Seasonal influenza is often quoted as having an IFR of 0.1 to 0.2%. The Stanford study suggests that COVID-19 might not, after all, be more deadly than flu. As though, as Ioannidis notes, the profile is very different. Seasonal flu has a higher IFR in developing countries where vaccination is rare, while COVID-19 has a higher death rate in the developed world, thanks in part of more elderly populations. The Stanford study, however, does not include the largest antibody study to date, that involving a randomized sample of 70,000 Spanish residents whose preliminary results were published by the Carlos III Institute of Health 2 weeks ago. That suggested that 5% of the Spanish population had been infected with the virus, with 27,000 deaths in the country. That would convert to an IFR of 1.1%. I suppose one of the big questions of COVID-19 is, what is the data going to show us? And are we ever going to get to see the data? I firmly suspect that the data is going to be massaged rather thoroughly by the experts in an attempt to conceal the failure of their predictions, and anyone who points out how data has been massaged will be accused of being a conspiracy theorist and will be censored. So speaking of red states versus blue states, I mean, the difference becomes starker with each passing day. This is a story from NBC5 in Chicago. Illinois Representative Darren Bailey was removed from the state legislature Wednesday after refusing to comply with a rule requiring all lawmakers to wear masks during the special session. After the state house voted overwhelmingly to adopt the rule, Democratic Representative Chris Welch made a motion to remove Bailey from the House proceedings. After Bailey refused to put on a mask, the House voted 81 to 27 to remove him from the chamber. Several House Republicans voted in favor of removing Bailey from the proceedings. We cannot ignore nor compromise the health and safety of every member in the General Assembly, their family members, and every one of our staffers who work tirelessly for us, House Republican leader Jim Durkin said. Bailey later told press gathered outside the session that he had also refused to take a coronavirus test prior to the session beginning. Lawmakers were asked to take a test, but it was not required. House Speaker Michael Madigan announced this week that the chamber would consider the rule change to help keep lawmakers, staffers, and family members safe. Under the rule, any lawmaker declining to wear a mask could be removed from the chamber by a vote of legislatures, and that is precisely what happened to Bailey. Illinois is a Democratic state, of course, the most corrupt state in the United States of America as well. It's not a coincidence. This is from Agence France-Presse. Michigan protesters launch Operation Haircut over lockdown. Barber Carl Mankey, who lost his license for violating lockdown rules by opening his business, gave haircuts at a protest outside Michigan's state capitol building. I'm pleased to see that the spirit of liberty still exists in the United States. Several hundred demonstrators, some not wearing face masks or practicing social distancing, lined up in Lansing under sunny skies for a free trim from hairstylists. Chairs were disinfected after each haircut. It was the fourth major protest against Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer's strict stay-at-home orders in a little more than a month. I would suggest that this is a much more effective protest than men in camo gear showing up with rifles. In late April, armed protesters entered the Capitol building in Lansing, demanding an easing of the lockdown put in place to curb the spread of the novel coronavirus. Michigan is one of the hardest hit U.S. states, with more than 5,000 deaths linked to the COVID-19, the disease caused by the virus. See, this would seem to be counterintuitive, because Michigan has one of the strictest lockdowns in the United States. It is the state where the governor banned people from buying seeds. You could go to stores where seeds were on sale, but the seeds could not be sold, and there had to be tape put around where the seeds were with an instruction that you may not buy seeds. The protest was organized by local conservative groups in support of Carl Menke, a barber who lost his license after opening his salon in early May to find the lockdown rules. Massages were also on offer at Wednesday's event in exchange for a token payment. Some demonstrators waved American flags and signs slamming Whitmer, who has extended lockdown measures until May the 28th. Whitmer is killing small businesses, read one sign. The governor, who was in the central part of the state to evaluate the damage from devastating floods caused when 2 dams were breached, said she understands residents' frustrations. Every one of us have made sacrifices at some point. Really? Really? Many are mourning the loss of loved ones, the loss of a job, of a business that might not open or survive this, but Gretchen is still getting her full salary. She pleaded with protesters to demonstrate in a way that does not expose themselves or others to a prolonged public health crisis. But the prolonged public health crisis is already here. It's been here for months, and the experts are telling us that it will last for months more, or perhaps forever. If people protest, I ask that they wear masks and observe the 6 feet apart, and if they don't, we will have to take some action, Whitmer warned. Police issued several tickets to the barbers, witnesses said. So Governor Karen is also not happy with Donald Trump. The Karens do not like Donald Trump. From the Mail, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer calls Donald Trump's threat to withhold federal funding as state faces catastrophic funding scary as he heads for Detroit to tour ventilator factory. Threatening to take money away from a state that is hurting as bad as we are right now is just scary, she said. 2 dams have burst and 10,000 residents have been evacuated in the northern part of the state as it deals with federal funding. Trump threatened to withhold federal funds from Michigan in revenge for states sending absentee ballot applications to voters. Trump will be in Detroit on Thursday to visit a Ford Motor factory that converted to making ventilators to combat coronavirus. And there was controversy over Trump not wearing a mask, with demands that he wear a mask. I don't know whether he wore one or not. Perhaps listeners could let me know. Gretchen Whitmer said, we've got to evacuate tens of thousands of people who are worried and scared on top of this global pandemic. The collapse of these dams, of course, this is just anecdotal evidence. It rather suggests to me, as I've been pointing out for some years, that there are gaps opening up in the transmission of civilization. That there were a lot of dam disasters in the early half of the last century. Then it seemed that the dam problem was solved. That building dams and dams that did not collapse and could be maintained, well, we seem to have mounted that hurdle, but I just wonder whether all of this knowledge is beginning to slip away as the collective knowledge of the Romans disappeared for about 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. Okay. According to Elaine He, in Bloomberg Opinion, the results of Europe's lockdown experiment are in. With governments across Europe reopening their economies for business, it's a good moment to look back on the different paths taken to control COVID-19 outbreaks to see how effective they were. And she relays information from the relative severity of Europe's restrictions based on work done by the University of Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government. And while not a gauge of whether the decisions taken were the right ones, nor of how strictly they were followed, the analysis gives a clear sense of each government's strategy for containing the virus. Some, above all Italy and Spain, enforced prolonged and strict lockdowns after infections took off, Others, especially Sweden, preferred a much more relaxed approach. Portland and Greece chose to close down while cases were relatively low. France and the UK took longer before deciding to impose the restrictive measures. But there's little correlation between the severity of a nation's restrictions and whether it managed to curb excess fatalities, a measure that looks at the overall number of deaths compared to normal trends. Roughly three groups of countries emerge in terms of fatalities. One group, including the UK, the Netherlands, and Spain, experienced extremely high excess mortality. Another, encompassing Sweden and Switzerland, suffered many more deaths than usual, but significantly less than the first group. Finally, there were countries where deaths remained within a normal range, such as Greece and Germany. Yet the data show that the relative strictness of a country's containment measures had little bearing on its membership in any of the three groups above. While Germany had milder restrictions than Italy, it has been much more successful in containing the virus. Well, there's so many variables here, and one of the most important variable would be, what is the median age of the people in your country? And in Italy, that is quite high indeed. Also, variables will be is, in general, how healthy are your people? What is the incidence of obesity, and in particular morbid obesity? Lung damage due to pollution would be another one. And comparing all of these countries without examination of these variables seems to me to be largely pointless. But this Oxford study, again, seems to vindicate the prediction which was made by General Ben Israel, that there's a 70-day period, that a peak at 40 days, and after 70 days, the disease is pretty much exhausted. Okay. One of the aspects of a totalitarian regime is the need for mandatory praise of government. And we're certainly seeing that all over the world. Here, we clap, and we bang pots and pans at 7 p.m. in the evening, local time. And in Britain, they clap. People go out to the doorstep and they clap for employees of the National Health Service. Paul Joseph Watson reports today, television channel ITV briefly went off air to encourage people in the UK to take part in the weekly clap for the NHS event. Yes, really. No TV allowed during worship, remarked a Twitter user who took a photo of the message which said, "We'll be back soon. Clap for carers." Clap for Carers is a weekly ritual whereby Brits are urged to stand outside their houses and on their balconies to applaud health workers. The practice has been called cringeworthy and akin to a religious ceremony by some, but millions of normies across the country take part in it with relish. As we have previously highlighted, one mother who forgot to take part in the clapathon, which takes place every Thursday at 8 p.m., was publicly shamed by her neighbors on Facebook the next day. In the United Kingdom, the NHS is treated as a religious institution by many, who insist that it is the envy of the world and a sterling example of the supremacy of government health care. In reality, as Dr. Theodore Dalrymple notes, quote, "When the NHS was founded, when British healthcare was among the best rather than the worst in Europe, the population of France had a life expectancy 6 years lower than that of Britain. It is now 2 years higher." A ranking of healthcare systems by the Lancet Medical Journal placed the NHS below Estonia and Slovenia, finding it to have an especially low score for cancer care. Dalrymple says the NHS worship clapathon reminds him of communist despotism. It reminds me a little, in its tendency to get longer and longer and almost more hysterical, of the applause after a speech by Nicolae Ceausescu or other communist despot, in which everyone in the audience had to show himself as enthusiastic and the most enthusiastic applauder, and to continue applauding as long as someone else was applauding, for to be the first to stop might be taken as a sign of disloyalty and dissent from the official line. I'll note that in recent years there have been quite a number of scandals where the NHS, in order to save money, has imported doctors from Europe, except they're not from Europe. They're Africans or Indians who are resident in Germany or some such country. And it turns out that some of these doctors, they don't understand decimal points, to give one example, which leads to poisonings. It's strange to me because I've been reading moaning about the NHS from the left and the right in Britain for decades, that much, much, much more funding is needed. The conditions in NHS hospitals are deplorable. I mentioned previously Tony Blair's great wheeze, reported on by Adam Curtis, that there is a big problem in Britain, similar to the one in my country, where people go to the emergency room, or A&E, or casualty, as they say it in Britain, and they wait and they wait and they wait, despite, broken legs or open wounds, this sort of thing, head injuries. And Tony Blair decided to hire a bunch of greeters a la Walmart. So people would walk through the doors and they would be greeted. So this slashed the waiting time. These people weren't being treated, but they could say, well, the waiting times have pretty much disappeared. So what is the situation in Britain? Well, London has recorded fewer than 100 COVID-19 cases a day for a fortnight. Official figures show, as expert reveals, 30% of hospital trusts nationwide have had no deaths in the last 2 days. The last time more than 100 cases diagnosed in London in a day was May the 7th. There were 1,000 plus at peak. By May 15th, the most recent reliable data, May 7th figure had been more than halved to 52. University of Oxford experts say that a third of England's hospitals have had no deaths for 48 hours. That's 41 out of 131. Now, one would think that this would be the cue for opening up Britain fully. But no, Boris Johnson appears to be in no hurry. By the way, I saw a picture of him that was printed in one of the British papers, I believe taken yesterday. He does not look in good shape at all. He appears to be flushed, disheveled, and considerably overweight. I would say, 40 to 60 pounds overweight? That would be my guess, which would put him, he had COVID-19 and he was in intensive care. And I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons that he suffered so badly was because of his obesity. Signs of the virus fading come as Brits have enjoyed looser lockdown restrictions this week and made their way to beaches and parks as the summer weather kicked off. Thousands of people are pictured in seaside resorts, including Bournemouth and Southend-on-Sea, provoking fears in some corners, that would be the Karen corner, that social distancing is being ignored. Meanwhile, politicians face the looming decision of whether they'll ease the rules even more on June the 1st. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, today said that families could soon be able to mix in small groups or play sports together as she set out the country's roadmap out of lockdown. Again, apparently Wales gets to make its own rules and Scotland gets to make its own rules, but England, which provides the money for both Wales and Scotland, does not get to be a nation. It does not get to make its own rules. It does not get its own parliament. It's really an appalling situation. Yes, actually, it is in this Mail piece. There's a picture of Boris. He's wearing trainers. He's wearing Adidas shorts. He's got a red and white baseball shirt, short sleeves, with something written on it that I can't read. He just looks in appalling condition. So going to Toby Young's wrap-up of lockdown skeptics. Good story on the Mail's front page today, but is it true? According to the paper, Boris has set a 10-day deadline to operationalize the government's track and trace program. Once it's in place, He's promised to dial down the lockdown. On the plus side, the number of people tested yesterday hit a record of 177,000, and the government has reportedly hired a 25,000 strong army of trackers. But if the NHS's contract tracing app is part of the plan, we may be in for a longer wait, and this is a disaster in the making. There is a legal challenge to the lockdown brought by Simon Dolan, described as an aviation entrepreneur. He filed over 1,000 pages of legal documents with the High Court this morning. The proceedings are against Matt Hancock, or as Peter Hitchens calls him, Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, whose name is on the lockdown laws, and Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education, who has presided over the closure of schools and universities. The aim of the court action is to lift the lockdown, restore our civil liberties, and allow schools, healthcare services, and the economy to restart. It is claimed that legislation of some years gives the government of Britain the power to seize pretty much any powers in the event of a health emergency. That may sound reasonable. Keep in mind, however, that medical experts have claimed for some years now that racism is a public health question, that misogyny is a public health question, that transphobia, so-called, is a public health question. I mean, there's no end to it. This is an example of what Thomas Szasz called the therapeutic state. A reader or a listener to this live stream, he asked a question on YouTube, why do you like Thomas Szasz? And I'll be talking about that a little later. Yes, the grim consequences for UK PLC of the coronavirus crisis are becoming clearer with every passing day. As GDP goes into free fall, public debt soars past £2 trillion and millions become unemployed. Apocalyptic predictions from the Bank of England and others show the UK is on track for the worst recession in 300 years when the Great Frost swept Europe. The Guardian reports the Chancellor's plans to spend yet more borrowed money on extending the mortgage relief scheme beyond the end of June, and adds that the Bank of England may move to negative interest rates, a first in its 325-year history. On the heels of yesterday's news that 9,000 jobs are being lost at Rolls-Royce, the Times reports that current plans for relaxing the lockdown may not be enough to save many businesses. Downing Street said yesterday that it has no plans to change the sensible and safe 2-meter social distancing rule after Robert Dingwall, a member of the government's new and emerging respiratory virus threats advisory group, NERVTAG, said the evidence that it is necessary is fragile. This is despite the fact that many other countries and even the World Health Organization recommend just 1 meter. Britain and Spain are now the only European countries to apply the 2-meter rule, says the Mail. Professor Dingwall said on the BBC, if you probe around the recommendations of distance in Europe, you will find that a lot of countries have also gone for this really on the basis of a better understanding of the scientific evidence around the possible transmission of infection. Ian Duncan Smith has also called for the 2-meter rule to be scrapped, according to The Sun. Well, as it was explained, I believe last week, yeah, it is 1 meter. But people, certainly in the government of Britain, decided to double it on the expectation that people would flout the rule. Yeah, so they just made it up. They just made it up in the same way that the chief medical officer for the Australian state of Queensland decided to close all the schools, even though she admitted publicly and was lionized for this in an Australian newspaper. She wanted to make a point how serious this is, despite the fact that there is very little risk to children, something which she acknowledged. Emma McClarkin, chief executive of the British Beer and Pub Association, told the paper that at 2 meters, you're probably looking at only 20% of pubs being able to operate, but reducing it to 1 meter would put the majority of pubs back in play. Other sectors have also raised concerns. Richard Walker, boss of Iceland, the supermarket said, the reality is that many businesses will not survive if we are too zealous with the 2-meter rule. If scientists and experts are comfortable with a way that we can relax it, then we absolutely should, because it is critical to so many sectors. Yeah, I wonder what would happen if these pubs simply decided that they're not going to bother with it. Are the police going to burst in and haul everyone away, or will they simply seek to strip the licenses for these places? I had a similar thought when smoking bans were instituted. What would happen if they simply were ignored in various pubs and bars? Steve Coogan, the creator of Alan Partridge, and as you know, I'm very fond of Alan Partridge, and by extension, Steve Coogan, but he just can't help stepping in it. He has furloughed his gardener and housekeeper. The wealthy comic 54 has left the taxpayer to stump up 80% of the pair's wages. His 2 staff work full-time at his £4 million home in southern England, which boasts a swimming pool and tennis court. Tory MP Andrew Bridgen said last night, the furlough scheme is to protect businesses that are suspended and can't operate during the coronavirus pandemic. It'd be difficult to see how Steve Coogan's earning potential has been diminished. And there's a picture here of Southern Beach yesterday, and golly, I see what appears to be hundreds of people who are not observing the 2-meter rule. I suppose they're all going to die. All the papers had pictures of people ignoring social distancing to enjoy Britain's hottest day of the year, with temperatures climbing to 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Although the snappers know their pictures are more likely to be used if they make it look as if people are bunched more closely together than they are. Needless to say, some local panjandrums have been harumping about the influx of visitors, according to The Telegraph, when Boris Johnson announced on May the 19th that from May the 13th, English residents would be allowed to drive to enjoy the outdoors for any length of time, so long as they do not stay overnight. Local authorities in places like the Lake District were in uproar, telling travelers firmly to stay away. In recent days, the row has rumbled on, with placards and barricades appearing in parts of the lakes. Messages scribbled onto boards include "No entry, please stay away," and in one specific case, "Keswick is still closed, please come back when we are open." This informal lockout has even included impromptu roadblocks with plastic barriers blocking routes to popular sites. And fewer people have died in 2019 to 20 than in 2017 to 18. Yeah, there is a huge, huge numbers problem. And I suppose, the media could deal with it the same way they dealt with the collapse of the Russiagate conspiracy theory. Oh, the election was stolen. Definitely stolen. That's not what the Mueller report says. You didn't read it thoroughly enough. And besides, there were things that Mueller couldn't put in there, and we don't have the supporting documents, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, they're just keep lying. So he writes, Toby Young writes, we published a great piece on lockdown skeptics today by Hector Drummond entitled "The Real Fault with Epidemiological Models." He's a former academic. He argues that critics of the computer modeling used by Neil Ferguson and his team at Imperial to show that 500,000 people would die from COVID-19 in the do-nothing scenario shouldn't focus on the poor quality of the code, because any number of epidemiological modelers could have come up with similar analyses using impeccable code. Rather, the fault lies with epidemiological models in general. Quote, epidemiology seems to be one of those areas, like climate change, where model reliability matters far less than it should. This can happen to areas that become politicized and where the journals are controlled by strong armed cliques. It can also be a consequence of modern academia, where the emphasis is shifted almost totally to funding success. Funding success in areas like epidemiology can depend on exaggeration to impress people with agendas and money to burn, like Bill Gates. In an objective field, you would expect, after all, underestimates to be as prevalent as overestimates. Yet in this field, overestimates are rife. And the reason for this is the same as the reason why alarmism thrives in climate science. It's because all the research money goes to those who sound the alarm bells. I'll point out, with regard to the infamous Environmental Protection Agency meta-analysis of the risks of secondhand smoke, they began by cherry-picking the studies, leaving out those that they thought would skew the results. So they ignored studies which they didn't like, and then they reduced the confidence level of the study. In the result, they came up with a pitiful figure of 1.19 risk, which is essentially statistical static. But this was the basis for the banning of smoking, well, pretty much everywhere. Now, there's another model. It comes from the University of Minnesota and was then invoked to justify Minnesota's lockdown. It was relied upon by Minnesota Governor Tim Walz when deciding how to respond to the pandemic. According to an article on the university's website, the model was developed by 3 graduate students who were called by a professor at the University School of Public Health on the evening of Friday, March 20th, and told the model needed to be ready to present to the governor on Monday morning. I don't think a lot of researchers get to work on something over the weekend and have public figures talk about it and make decisions based on it 3 days later, said Marina Kirkide, who was on a gap year when she got the call. The model predicted that 57,000 Minnesotans would die absent a lockdown, and Governor Walz duly issued a stay-at-home order on March 25th. So how shonky was the grad student's model? I asked Sue Denim, the ex-Google engineer who reviewed Professor Ferguson's model, to take a look. He looked at the code, and he said that it's of significantly higher quality than the code from Imperial College. Model-wise, it explicitly takes into account hospital capacity, whereas Ferguson's model ignored beds and assumed constant capacity throughout the entire epidemic. It has 36 parameters versus the over 400 parameters found in the ICL code. This is still large, but more reasonable. Professor Ferguson's team should sit through some lectures given by these students. So that's the good news. Unfortunately, it's outweighed by the bad news. I agree with your readers' comments about the dodgy assumptions. It's obvious these models have severe theoretical flaws, as different code bases keep generating predictions that are wrong, and always wrong in the same direction and magnitude. Beyond parametric difficulties, and although this team doesn't seem to have made the same kinds of staggering coding errors found in the ICL code base, this is still academic code, so the critical structural and process problems identified in my first and second analysis of the ICL code are still present. Like before, the history of this program is missing. Taxpayers being able to check the work that was actually used to change policy is seen as unimportant. Although there are no COVID-specific assumptions in the code, it was written fresh for this problem instead of reusing a battle-tested infrastructure. There is still no unit or regression tests of any kind. Given this attitude, is it any wonder that epidemiological models keep producing estimates that are wrong when compared to real-world outcomes? Yet this doesn't seem to bother anyone in the field, and models appear no more accurate today than they were during the UK foot and mouth epidemic in 2001. Given the lack of any really COVID-specific assumptions that we're seeing here, it would make sense to use generic models that are extensively unit tested against prior observed outcomes, but we don't see that. Imagine if a piece of safety-critical software controlling a car were thrown together in a few days by some interns, sold into the market, and then went wrong in some way that caused people to die. People would be incredibly angry. It would end up in court. In fact, we don't have to imagine, because the case of the Toyota engine control system gives an example of what happens when standard practices aren't followed. The code for the Toyota ECS looked very much like the code for COVID Sim. Written in C, many global variables, no working peer review process, and other problematic practices. Although I think it was never proven that this led to unintended accelerations that killed people, there was also no way to convince a jury it didn't. Unlike in academia, where so far we've seen widespread denial that any problems exist at all, Toyota ended up recalling nearly 10 million cars and dealing with multiple lawsuits. In one of those, the court heard testimony about code quality. Toyota settled after they realized the testimony was devastating and they couldn't win. And oh yes, Ron DeSantis is the governor of Florida, and he had rather a resplendent moment yesterday because the media was saying that in opening up pretty much faster than any of the states that hadn't locked down at all, that he was condemning many thousands of people to die. Well, that has not happened. As I mentioned, that the deaths in Florida are what? 1/11 of what they are in New York, which has roughly the same population. So he had a go at the media for this. And I suppose the media, I don't know, pointing out to the media that they're acting from bad faith, that they get things wrong again and again and again, and all their other failings. It's rather like arguing with a cat. You know, they just look at you, or they look away, or they walk away, because they're not interested. They are simply not interested. C.J. Hopkins in the Off Guardian announces in a piece called Brave New Normal Part 2 that he or she, I don't know whether this is a man or a woman, my columns haven't been very funny recently. This one isn't going to be any funny. Sorry, fascism makes me cranky. I don't mean the kind of fascism the corporate media and the fake resistance have been desperately hyping for the last 4 years. God help me, but I'm not terribly worried about a few hundred white supremacist morons marching around with tiki torches, hollering Nazi slogans at each other, or Jewish Mexican-American law clerks flashing OK signs on TV, or smirking school kids in MAGA hats. I'm talking about actual bona fide fascism or totalitarianism, if you want to get technical. The kind where governments declare a global state of emergency on account of a virus with a 0.2 to 0.6 lethality, and that causes mild flu-like symptoms or absolutely no symptoms whatsoever in over 97% of those infected, locks everyone down inside their houses, suspends their constitutional rights, terrorizes them with propaganda, and unleashes uniformed goon squads on anyone who doesn't comply with their despotic decrees. I'm talking about the kind of totalitarianism where the police track you down with your smartphone data and then come to your house to personally harass you for attending a political protest or attack you for challenging their illegitimate authority and then charge you with assault for fighting back and then get the media to publish a story accusing you of having set up the cops. I'm talking about the kind of totalitarianism where the secret police are given carte blanche to monitor everyone's internet activity and to scan you with their surveillance helmets and to dictate how close you can sit to your friends and menace you with drones and robot dogs and violently pry your kids out of your arms and arrest you if you dare to protest. I'm talking about the kind of totalitarianism that psychologically tortures children with authoritarian loyalty rituals designed to condition them to live in fear and respond to absurd Pavlovian stimuli, and that encourages the masses to turn off their brains and mechanically repeat propaganda slogans like wear a mask and flatten the curve, and report their neighbors to the police for having an illegal private party, and to otherwise reify the manufactured mass hysteria the authorities need to justify their totalitarianism. Yeah, that kind of stuff makes me cranky. And you know what makes me really cranky? I'll tell you what makes me really cranky. It is people who publicly project themselves as anti-authoritarians or anti-fascists, or who have manufactured their anti-establishment brands and dissident personas on social media or even in the corporate media, either zealously cheerleading this totalitarianism or looking away and saying nothing as it is rolled out by the very authorities and media propagandists they pretend to oppose. I don't know exactly why, but that stuff makes me particularly cranky. I'll provide you with a few examples. The militant Portland anti-fascists who used the corporate media, who the corporate media fell in love with and made famous for bravely fighting off the Trump-loving Putin Nazi menace over the course of the last few years. As soon as the corona totalitarianism began, did what all true anti-fascists do when the state goes full-blown fascist. No, they did not smash the state or occupy the streets or anything like that. They masked up and started making vegan hand sanitizer. Popular internet anti-imperialists started accusing everyone opposing the lockdown as being part of some far-right Republican plot to promote mass death under the banner of freedom, or to normalize death to benefit rich people, or being members of a death cult or something. Celebrity socialists took to Twitter to warn that we would shortly have the blood of thousands of people on our hands and call us anti-vaxxers. Indie political and military analysts patiently explained why government needed to be able to pull people out of their homes against their will and quarantine them. Others simply looked away or sat in silence as we were confined to our homes and made to carry permission papers to walk to work or the corner grocery store, and were beaten and arrested for not social distancing, and were otherwise bullied and humiliated for no justifiable reason whatsoever. We are talking about a virus, after all, that even the official medical experts, e.g. the UK's chief medic, admit is more or less harmless to the vast majority of us, not the bubonic plague or some sort of alien terrorist death flu. So spare me the we had no choice but to go totalitarian rationalization. The brave new normal official narrative has been born but has not yet taken hold. What happens next will determine whether it works. In order to understand how this works, imagine for a moment that you're one of those people who are normally skeptical of the government and the media, and that you consider yourself an anti-authoritarian, or at least a friend of the working classes, and now you are beginning to realize that there is no alien terrorist death flu, just as there were no WMDs, no Russian hackers, no P-tape, etc. So it dawns on you that you've been behaving like a hysterical, brainwashed fascist minion of the very establishment you supposedly oppose, or at the very least, like an abject coward. Imagine how you might feel right now. You'd probably feel pretty foolish, right? And more than a little ashamed of yourself. So, okay, what do you do about that? Option number one would be admit what you did, apologize to whomever you have to, and try like hell not to do it again. Not many people are going to choose this option. Most people are going to choose option number two, which is to desperately try to deny what they did or to desperately rationalize what they did, and in many cases are still actively doing. Now, this is not as easy as it sounds, because doing that means they will have to continue to believe, or at least pretend to believe, that there is an alien terrorist death flu, which is going to kill hundreds of millions of people the moment we stop locking everyone down and forcing them to social distance and such like. And this is where that Orwellian doublethink comes in. People are not going to want to face the fact that they've been behaving like a bunch of fascists or cowards for no justifiable reason whatsoever. So what they are going to do instead is desperately pretend that their behavior was justified, and the propaganda they have been swallowing and regurgitating was not propaganda, but rather the truth. In other words, in order to avoid their shame, they're going to do everything in their power to reify the official narrative and delegitimize anyone attempting to expose it as the fiction that it is. They're going to join in with the corporate media that are calling us extremists, conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxers, and other such epithets. They're going to accuse those of us on the left of aligning with far-right Republican militias and boogaloo accelerationists, and of being members of the Russian-based Queer Front and assorted other horrible things meant to scare errant lefties in the line. Above all, they're going to continue to insist, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that we are under attack by a killer virus, which could strike again at any time, and so we have to maintain at least some level of totalitarianism and paranoia, or else, well, you know, the terrorists win. Oh, speaking of models, there are models for everything. I guess we don't need pundits anymore. You see, but the pundits make predictions, and they are often wrong. I don't like to make short-term predictions, and I pretty much stopped doing that because there's too many variables involved. Although I did predict that Trump was going to win the 2016 presidential election, but that was rather for a specific reason, because I realized that if Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election, that would prove that God hates America, and I do not believe that God hates America. So a new model has predicted that President Trump will lose the 2020 election by a landslide due to the floundering economy amid the coronavirus crisis. The national election model released by Oxford Economics on Wednesday predicted rising unemployment and inflation will prevent Trump from being elected. The study predicted that the president would win just 35% of the popular vote, which makes a sharp turnaround from the group's coronavirus prediction, which put Trump at winning 55% of the vote last fall. In 2016, he lost the popular vote, gaining 46.2% to Hillary Clinton's 48.1%, but secured victory by taking Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by razor-thin margins, and Florida, too. Does this model, does it consider who the Democratic candidate is going to be? For instance, a zombie like Joe Biden, who just becomes more death-like or risen from the grave with each passing day? I wonder about that. I really wonder about that. You see, most of the pundits in the United States were grievously wrong about the results of the 2016 election, but, you know, they can say, we're only human. They can say that. Most of the time they pretend to be the voice of God. But computers, well, these models, they're supposed to be perfect. It's science, people. It is science. And I'm reminded that epidemiology is, it's really the study of correlations. It's really nothing more than that. For instance, epidemiology proves a very strong correlation between smoking cigarettes and getting lung cancer. However, it does not demonstrate that smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer, because the cause of cancer is simply not known. Oh, yes, the COVID-19 panic and destruction, bad for most people, good for others. Of course, we find that in all crises. This is from the Wall Street Journal. After pushing the pause button during the coronavirus pandemic, big enterprise technology companies later this year are expected to go on a shopping spree for smaller tech firms, industry analysts say. The tighter market could leave fewer options for cash-strapped chief information officers. What this means for CIOs is likely higher prices and less choice, said Crawford Del Pret, president of International Data Corps. He said that many large IT providers over the next few years will be looking to fill gaps or expand into new markets, in part by targeting embattled startups struggling to reignite sales and raise capital. Microsoft said Tuesday it was acquiring Softomotive, a robotic process automation maker that enables businesses to automate workplace tasks, a capability many businesses have turned to in order to keep daily operations running with a thinner workforce. Walmart has leveraged this position to grab more of the retail market, reporting a 10% increase in U.S. sales for the quarter ended May the 1st. Uber is in talks to buy Grubhub, the Wall Street Journal reported. The move would hand it a ready platform for delivery ordering, meaning Uber wouldn't need to build out its own division, Uber Eats, and would gain an advantage over competitors like industry leader DoorDash. Beyond a handful of deals, tech M&A activity has dropped off sharply as companies big and small deal with uncertain economic conditions. Yeah, so we're going to get more scale. Again, some people thought that one of the results of COVID-19 would be a realization that scale is one of the major reasons of why this has turned into such a disaster. But it reminds me of something I once heard Malcolm Muggeridge said. He spoke in Vancouver, and I went to see him. And this was before, the collapse of the Soviet Union. I suppose it would have been in the, around 1980, I suppose it was. And he was talking about socialism, and he said it's a curious thing that in response to the failures of socialism, the demand is always for more socialism. And here we see similarly that globalism, neoliberalism, turbo-capitalism, whatever you want to call it, is the new socialism. It's the new communism. It's scientific, it's historic, it's ineluctable. It cannot be stopped. So the solution to the problem of the failures of more neoliberalism, globalism, scale, more of the same. It makes sense. A piece here, Levi Parsons, writing for the Daily Mail Australia, writes why you must question everything Beijing says. He reports on how he was ordered to cover up the outbreak of a deadly disease on Australia's doorstep with eerie similarities to the COVID-19 debacle. While working in Papua New Guinea, he was not allowed to cover the polio outbreak. Some members of his Xinhua team feared overshadowing Xi Jinping's visit. China tried to keep the world in the dark and stop news of the outbreak spreading. Now China is accused of a similar cover-up over the coronavirus panic. Well, I don't think that's really a surprise, is it? I think it's going to be hard for the globalists, the neoliberalists, to continue to force everyone to love China, because the recent polling has shown, I mean, indisputably, that China is well hated and not trusted at all in the West now, and we've only begun to get information from China about what really happened. A sidebar in this story: China's President Xi Jinping knew about the coronavirus on January 7th, yet China shut down only the center of the outbreak, Hubei province, on January 23rd, after 5 million people had left to travel throughout China and the world. China has since admitting destroying early samples of coronavirus in January, but claims it was acting in the interests of public health and denies stonewalling sample requests from other countries. The U.S. has accused China of concealing the severity of the virus and hoarding medical supplies while the world was still unaware of the threat. That's not just an accusation, it's the truth. China is also accused of silencing doctors, making whistleblowers disappear, hiding the true death toll, suppressing information and censoring news reports during the early stages of the outbreak, and pressuring the World Health Organization to delay public warnings and downplay the risks of the epidemic. A German intelligence report claims President Xi personally asked WHO President Tedros Ghebreyesus to hold back information about human-to-human transmission and delay a pandemic warning. The report claims China's information policy cost the world 4 to 6 weeks of vital time needed to fight the virus. Now, people will say, Kevin, you don't think the virus is as serious, as deadly as it has been said to be. That is true. But again, there's another similarity with AIDS. I do not believe that HIV causes AIDS, but in the event, it doesn't matter. Because what happened is that a great many people were tested, and they were found to have antibodies for HIV, and as a result, they were treated as AIDS patients, and they were given medicine which caused them to quickly sicken and die. So, it's the results that I'm interested in. And the results of COVID-19, regardless of the nature of the virus itself, have been catastrophic. I'm going to move on to the situation in Canada. Around 5:30, I'm going to be talking on Theatre Thursday about Horse Girl, starring Alison Brie. So, number of cases in Canada is up to 80,544. And the number of deaths in Canada, 38 million people here, 6,152. Oh, Saskatchewan has caught up with Manitoba. They each now have 7 COVID-19 deaths. And I'll point out that both of these provinces have more than 1 million people. So let's see, do we have an update on British Columbia? I mean, the island is opening up, but it was never really a problem here. There's barely over 100 cases on Vancouver Island and something like 3 deaths. This in no way justifies what was done. But they must have the same rules for all. So obviously, Greater Vancouver, well, the rules must be same there as they are on Vancouver Island, despite the fact that Vancouver Island is an island. But no, that would, yes, 126 cases on Vancouver Island. Okay, Brian Lilly, who's a reporter, was trending on Twitter in Canada today because he wrote a piece for Post Media saying that Dr. Theresa Tam needs to go. She is Canada's chief medical officer. She has been more often than she has been right, and for that reason, she needs to be relieved of her duties. And he points out that she said back in January that not a problem, not a problem, not a big problem, and border screening flights from China, banning flights, no, not necessary. Not necessary at all. She said border controls were counterproductive. She implied they were racist and lectured the country about being inclusive. Not surprisingly, her annual report, released last December, just before COVID struck, was titled Addressing Stigma Towards a More Inclusive Health System. And so then she did a 180 on this, and oh my God, we're all going to die unless there's a lockdown. For months, following the advice of the World Health Organization, she had stated repeatedly that it was not necessary and probably not efficacious for people not on the so-called front lines to wear masks. And within the last week, she reversed herself on that as well. Now, people who are attacking Brian Lilly were saying, oh, he's not an epidemiologist. Dr. Theresa Tam is not an epidemiologist. She is a pediatrician. Let's see. Oh, yes, more standing for the female health officers. A hagiography of our own Dr. Bonnie Henry appears in the CBC, and she came up with this slogan: be kind, be calm, and be safe. Was it kind to declare most of the businesses in British Columbia to be non-essential and then shut down? Was that kind? Was it calm to encourage people to fear every single other person on earth as a deadly threat to them? And being safe. Oh, well, it turns out our nursing homes, they're certainly not safe. Not safe at all. But Dr. Bonnie Henry is, she's the hero of the hour. Oh, yes, the second wave of COVID-19 is inevitable, she says. Oh, you mean like repeated waves of influenza are inevitable? Influenza kills an awful lot of people, and somehow we manage to deal with that without destroying the economy, destroying society, and suppressing civil liberties. The intelligence service in Canada, which is called CSIS, has become woke. Canada's domestic intelligence agency is changing how it talks about extremist threats, adopting a broader vocabulary to include violence inspired by incels, ethno-nationalists, and other fringe groups. The move comes just a day after authorities laid Canada's first incel-related terrorism charge against a 17-year-old accused of fatally stabbing a woman at a North York, that's Toronto, massage parlor. CSIS is now classifying violent extremism, terrorism by motivation, religious, ideological, or political. I would suggest that a 17-year-old who goes to a erotic massage parlor and stabs one of the sex workers in the neck, I don't really know how political this crime was. I would also like to know whether he was a marijuana user and or on antidepressants. I'd very much like to know this. I don't think that we're going to be told. I've spoken about this woman who apparently is something of a big deal in the world of Canadian journalism, called Lisa Van Dusen, and based on her last name, where she is and what she does, she is part of the extended Grace clan, either by biology or marriage. She's associate editor of Policy Magazine and a columnist for the Hill Times. She has this extraordinary column today called Can the Intelligence Community Save Democracy? Her argument is the intelligence community, the global intelligence community, has not been up to snuff, because it has allowed people like Donald Trump to be elected. I am not making this up. And she seems to be very upset that U.S. intelligence officials are now quite wary about China. I'll read you a paragraph here. How does a dog not only bark but not twitch during an assault so brazen that it produced the relentless, deadly lunacy of Donald Trump's presidency and still spend $500 billion? If the intelligence community wasn't bugging, tracking, hacking, and counter-operating against global anti-democracy interests, who was it bugging, tracking, hacking, and counter-operating against? You see, the very strong implication here is that the global intelligence community should have been bugging, tracking, hacking, and counter-operating against Donald Trump, who is described as a global anti-democracy figure, despite being democratically elected as president of the United States. Now with the global pandemic being leveraged as a power grab by those same anti-democracy interests. Oh, I see. So it's people like Donald Trump that apparently want to keep the United States locked down forever. No, actually, it's the reverse. And a presidential election under attack by not just Russia, here we go again, and other usual suspects, but also by the incumbent himself. Can the intelligence community marshal its formidable outcome curating powers? Wow, there's a euphemism for you. To thwart corruption, restore sanity, and save democracy, taking public responsibility for the integrity of the process that will produce November's U.S. election might be a good start. Oh, I see. So we're going to turn over the presidential election in November to the spooks. If that fails, at least people will know precisely what sort of war they're dealing with. It seems, so far at least, it's not a cold one. Is this woman deranged? It's not a cold war. So then that would be a hot war. Has Donald Trump started lobbing missiles into New York City? I think I would have heard of that if it happened. As I mentioned earlier, someone had asked me on YouTube comment why I liked Thomas Saz, and the suggestion was that I suppose personally and in his beliefs he would be alien to me. Thomas Saz was born in Hungary in 1920, and he died in New York State in 2012. He was a psychiatrist and a professor and a prolific author. And one of the reasons that I've learned so much from Thomas Saz is that he is a beautiful writer. He's a very precise writer as well. He took words seriously. And it was amusing to me that he wrote a book about Karl Kraus, who was a Viennese literature, who was a great enemy of Sigmund Freud. And there had been collections of Kraus's aphorisms, and they were not, by native English speakers. And they were not done very well. And Zaz translated some few hundreds of them, and he did a much better job than people who had actually been born in the United States of America. Zaz was a Jewish atheist who took his own life and believed in the right to unlimited drug use, suicide, essentially, unlimited personal autonomy, except where, crimes were committed or, violence against other people were committed. Thomas Saz believed that people should be held responsible for their actions. This is now considered to be exceedingly controversial. Let's take psychiatric patients, particularly those who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And today's movie is about schizophrenia. Well, they often commit violence against other people, murder, in fact. Typically, they're mothers. And they are indulged for the longest time. They commit various crimes of destruction, crimes of violence, threats of violence, stalking, all that sort of thing. And this is all waved away because they're suffering from a disease, and that we must stop stigmatizing people who suffer from mental illness, because mental illness is a disease like any other disease. Zaz's most famous book is called The Myth of Mental Illness. Now, what he meant by a myth is he did not deny that there was a thing called mental illness, and that people with mental illness suffered from various delusions. But it was a myth because it was not a disease like other diseases. Where are the lesions, for instance? With regard to what he said about schizophrenia, is actually true of all mental illnesses except organic mental illnesses such as tertiary syphilis, which is there are no cases of asymptomatic schizophrenia. The symptoms are the disease. It is that simple. Azaz wrote some years ago that, and you might remember this, dear listeners, that we heard a lot of talk a few decades ago about brain chemistry, that schizophrenia and other mental diseases were due to faulty brain chemistry. We don't hear anything about that anymore, strangely enough. Perhaps we've gone back to the societal explanation of R.D. Laing. So what Zaz did was he got all the latest textbook on pathology, because he was a medical doctor, and he looked through them to see, okay, schizophrenics, they die, so we're going to slice open their brains and examine their brain chemistry. No, it wasn't in there. It wasn't in there. And we're going through something very similar now with transsexuals. If you hear transsexuals explain their situation, you will hear a lot about endocrinology. Again, something wrong with their body chemistry. There's no evidence of this whatsoever. But these appeals to science or pseudoscience are very powerful. Very powerful. Zaz, again, was an atheist, but he pointed out in his books that the medical profession and science generally makes greater claims on people and society than even Catholic priests during the Middle Ages, which is quite something. The first book by Zaz that I ever read, I started reading him, I guess around 1974, was The Problem of Pain. And it's a fascinating subject. As Zaz points out, pain is not something that can be measured. It simply can't. We know that pain exists, but in terms of its intensity, we have to go by, various signs, the patient exhibits. Crying, howling, writhing, whatever, or an explanation. Oh, I'm feeling a little pain. I'm suffering moderate pain. I'm in excruciating agony. But the fact is that this simply cannot be quantified. Zaz talked about the therapeutic state. Now, everything is now seen as a disease, and I mentioned earlier in the show, racism is seen as a disease now. Misogyny is seen as a disease now. And this is truly chilling because it means it gives the government an excuse to take away everyone's civil rights. Racism must be dealt with. It's a medical issue. You're not against medicine, are you? You're not against science, are you? As far as drugs, I disagreed with Zaz about everyone's freedom to use whatever drugs they like. But on the other hand, I believe he's absolutely right when he says that the idea of drug addiction is fanciful. I mean, Theodore Dalrymple has written about this. It seems to be the result of social conditioning. We have been conditioned to believe that heroin addiction, for instance, it's the toughest thing in the world to quit, that it is an agonizing process that could take weeks and weeks and weeks. The Dalrymple reports that they throw people in prison in Asia and they come out after a weekend or whatever and they're no longer addicted. It's that simple. Zaz pointed out that any drug that people like to take, in fact, any substance that people like to take, or any activity in which people choose to indulge in is going to be eventually referred to as an addiction. Again, he called these, problems in living, and not all problems in living can be solved. It seemed to be fairly obvious to me. From Wikipedia, with regard to the therapeutic state, the collaboration between psychiatry and government leads to what Zaz calls the therapeutic state, a system in which disapproved actions, thoughts, and emotions are repressed through pseudo-medical interventions. Now, people are going to say, oh, what about throwing all the people out of the asylums in the 1980s? Zaz responded that he thought that most of those people shouldn't have been in the asylum in the first place, but once their lives had been wrecked by the imprisonment and the treatment, that it was certainly not reasonable to send these people out into the wild with no resources. It simply wasn't. That, it's one of the craziest things that has happened in my lifetime. That mental illness used to be something that people were ashamed of. It was a taboo. If you had it or it was prevalent in your family, this would often be suppressed. But now, more and more people are proud to suffer from a mental illness. And in fact, you're seen to be somehow insufficient as a person if you cannot claim to suffer from some mental illness. I recall there was a big conference at the University of British Columbia in 1978. Margaret Mead was there, the famous anthropologist. I saw her waddling down the street. She was very short and very wide. She was almost as wide as she was short. Very amusing to see. And Jimmy Carter's wife was there, Rosalind Carter, who was an expert on something for some reason. And she claimed about half the people in the United States suffer from some sort of mental illness. What are we talking about then? Because that would make it normative. Let's see. Thomas Zaz demonstrated in one of his books that Sigmund Freud was a fraud. That Sigmund Freud admitted in his writing that he created psychoanalysis in order to destroy Christianity because of the insults that he believed that his father had suffered from Christians. And that would seem to discredit it, apart from the fact that none of the claims made by Freud can be proved. They're not even hypotheses, So, I've long believed that it is possible to learn from people with whom one disagrees. And I suppose on the big moral questions, I disagreed with Thomas Zaz very strongly. But on the intellectual questions, I agreed with him strongly, because I think that he was an honest man, and that he suffered an enormous amount of abuse because of his work for decades. He became a bogey man. Zaz was also a fine aphorist himself, and this is my favorite of his aphorisms, which explains so much about societal behavior. In the animal kingdom, the rule is eat or be eaten. In the human kingdom, define or be defined. So I'm going to move on to the book club here. The movie is called Horse Girl. It's a Netflix film from last year. No, wait, this year. It's hard to keep track of the time. I saw this cartoon, What in the Spectator. Two middle-aged people sprawled in their chairs, sort of dumbly looking at the TV. What time is it? Is it still March? Feels like that. Anyway, the film is directed and produced by Jeff Baena. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing that name right. It stars Alison Brie. It is also co-written and co-produced by Alison Brie. A very talented woman she is. And as I said earlier, what this movie is an attempt to explain schizophrenia from the point of view of schizophrenic. Now, this is difficult to do. I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult intellectually, and it's difficult, I suppose, to put it on the screen. Um, if listeners are interested, I can highly recommend a novel by the great English writer called Colin Truebron called A Cruel Madness, which is on this very subject. I should mention a few things off the top about this film. That I like the cinematography by Sean McElwee very much. It is not flashy. We do not have these rapid cuts. Everything, you can see what is going on in the screen. It's not underlit. It's not overlit. And the cast, I think Alison Brie is outstanding in this. And you see there's a lot of fine character actors in this, including Paul Reiser, who I haven't seen in a while, and he's almost unrecognizable now. He plays a nice guy instead of his usual jerk. Nice change of pace. Molly Shannon, who many of you will remember from Saturday Night Live. She plays Joan, a woman who Sarah, our lead character, works with. She's sort of the in charge of this craft shop, which they work. She's very sympathetic in this. Let's see. I was delighted to see Robin Tunney play one of the leads. There's a show within the show called Purgatory, and I'll get to that in a moment. They're a really lovely Irish-American woman. Very pleased to see her in this. Matthew Gray Gubler, who plays, he plays two roles in Purgatory. He is very good as well. Toby Huss, who was on King of the Hill. He played Hank's father, and he played the Laotian neighbor. He was the Wiz on Seinfeld. And David Paymer, who I've always liked. He's always good. Yeah, he plays a doctor who is, let us say, bemused and apparently perhaps even terrified by the words that are coming out of Alison Brie's mouth. So this is a movie that doesn't reveal everything up front. In fact, the narrative is rather fractured, and that is on purpose. And the narrative describes pretty much a perfect circle. And Sarah is, she's a very nondescript person. She's a very nice person. She works at this craft store, and she's close to Molly Shannon, but they're work friends. They're not, off-work friends. Alison Brie's character, Sarah, she doesn't have any friends. And we don't really know why this is. I mean, the costume design is such that the clothes that she wears, she wears these terrible clothes. Just mom jeans and stuff like she, blouses and the like. She looks like she picked up for $3 or whatever at Walmart. Very nondescript. And her hair is not done in a particularly attractive style. But nonetheless, I mean, she's still a very attractive woman, but there's something off about her. This is best expressed in the first meeting between Sarah and what would be John Reynolds plays Darren. And you think there's going to be a romance there. I should say that this John Reynolds, he quite impressed me as the character Darren. He seems like a nice young boy, but very awkward. There's a little party for Sarah's birthday. Her roommate was rather surprised to see Sarah at home on her birthday when she said that she'd had plans and she's watching this show Purgatory again. She binge watched it many times. And so, come on, my boyfriend's, he has a new roommate who's single. Four of us will get together. It's a very amusing scene because of Sarah's awkwardness and a sort of bullying confidence of the roommate, Nikki, who's well played by Debbie Ryan. And Nikki's boyfriend is an idiot. That he makes rap music, and it's terrible. And he talks about he insists upon playing the entire record that he's made. And amusingly, this is very underplayed, that Darren keeps saying, "How many tracks are there? You gonna play all of them?" And the boyfriend is too dumb to get what's going on, but he calls them track 1, track 2, track 3, and he says it's a concept album. I'm calling it a baker's dozen. And Darren says, "What, is there a hidden track? What are you talking about?" "Well, baker's dozen is 13. "No, it's a dozen, a baker's dozen." And he says, "Have you ever been to a bakery?" "What bakery?" "Any bakery." "Why?" "Because a baker's dozen, you buy 12 and they give you another one, as a treat." And the idiot boyfriend says, "That's just semantics. It's a concept album." Earlier, Darren had confessed to Sarah, I suppose he is rather scarred by a relationship, a 2.5-year relationship that he'd been in, for all sorts of reasons. That he had this dominant girlfriend who refused to refer to him as her boyfriend, who chose his clothing for him and insisted that he wear it, and he found himself wearing a lot of purple. I mentioned that women seem to love the color purple, and that he found himself wearing these leather bracelets, a whole bunch of them at a time. As I say, this Darren fellow, he's very likable. But there's a scene where they're alone, and yep, marijuana is consumed and wine is consumed, and it's okay. You're together, you're both high, you both seem to like each other. This is the time when you kiss, and that happens twice. And I'm making this, sign in front of the screen. Come on, come on. Nope, just there's some awkward hugging. But then there's a later suggestion they get together for a date, which turns out to be disastrous and disturbing. Purgatory, the show within the show, it seems to be a sort of combination of these medical examiner shows and also demons amongst us. And it's the kind of demonic rubbish that women, particularly younger women these days, cannot get enough of. This stuff is dangerous. It's dangerous to your mind and to your soul. Earlier, whilst at the shop, Sarah had a customer. It turns out that she read the tarot, and she wanted the example of a particular type of cloth for its protective qualities. And she gives to Sarah a kind of her card, but also a kind of amulet. And she says this has protective qualities too. Later, Sarah, who can knit, starts making these protective devices, and this is common, exceedingly common, to people who become involved in the occult. That they become terrified that they're under attack by evil spirits, and that they need protection from these evil spirits. You do not want to invite evil spirits into your life. You simply don't. The suggestion is that you can somehow control them, but even if you could derive some power from them, the question you'd have to ask would be, what do they want from you? And what they want from you is everything. Now, we learn in a flashback, we see Sarah doing these things with people, and we don't understand who these people are, but it's explained. We see Sarah visiting a a young woman, younger than herself, who appears to be crippled in some way, brain damaged. She has difficulty in talking and in walking, and she has a very slight figure. I mean, too slight. And then we learn later that she had been a horse rider, and she had been thrown from a horse and suffered significant brain injuries leading to the conditions I described, plus epilepsy. And Sarah was in the paddock at the same time and witnessed this. And it set off a psychotic reaction in her where she was institutionalized. She keeps going back to the paddock, and Toby Huss is there. I don't know, with his wife, or I would assume they run this, and they don't want Sarah there. She doesn't notice this. She's quite obtuse to social signaling. Why don't they want her there? Well, because there's a horse that she's in love with called Willow, and that was her horse. But she doesn't ride Willow anymore, and the suggestion is that she stopped riding after this terrible accident that she witnessed. But she goes to groom the horse and pet the horse, and the owners, they don't want her there because she is bad juju. But she keeps showing up to the increasing annoyment of the people who own it. Sarah is experiencing difficulties with sleep, with insomnia or the sleep displacement, also lucid dreams. Now, again, there are not a few people who are fascinated by the concept of the lucid dream, which is to say a dream that you can control. You do not want to get involved in lucid dreams. You simply do not. You do not want to put yourself in a situation where you increasingly become unable to distinguish between reality and fantasy. This is what mental illness, and particularly schizophrenia, is. It is a complete breakdown of the understanding between reality and fantasy. And we see this happen with Sarah. That eventually she comes to believe, and this is the absolute epitome of madness, that what we believe to be reality is simply a social construct, or it is a deliberate construct by them. They want you to think that this is the way the world works. Sarah is a typical schizophrenic. Well, there's far more male schizophrenics than female schizophrenics. But if you look at the nature of schizophrenia, you have people who are unimportant, and they decide that they are important, and that it's going to be proved that they are important. And how are they important? They're important because they know a truth that the rest of the world doesn't know or insists upon denying, that there are evil forces at work in the world, and it is their mission to save the world, or at least save themselves and people close to them from this evil which has taken over the world and is attempting to take over themselves. And this typically escalates. The insanity escalates, and it typically involves physical violence. There's no physical violence in this film displayed by Sarah except a threat of her boyfriend being stabbed, which I'll get to in a moment. And someone pointed out to me on Twitter, it's not simply a question of one's brain stopping to work, because these people hear voices, and the voices never say plant flowers. The voices always say stab people. And what characterizes the schizophrenic is a unified field theory. And the genius of its construction is that it includes all possible variables. And we see this happen with Sarah, and the movie is very clever. That incorporates the demonism of purgatory, the mark of Hades specifically. And it incorporates the tarot. It incorporates a lunatic rant, which Sarah hears outside the place where she works, where some probably homeless person carrying on about Satiko satellites. And Satiko satellites, they run everything. They run electricity. And they control everyone, or they control the aliens, and the aliens control everyone. And the idea of protective things, protective totems, is integrated into this as well. The use of a particular fabric as a protective totem is integrated into this as well. And also the history of Sarah's family. Now, it's a commonplace that the best predictor for mental illness in people is mental illness in one's family. But I have to think that this has increased in recent years because not that long ago, as I mentioned earlier, insanity was a taboo. So, knowledge of it was suppressed. But on the other hand, it was quite common for people to laugh about it. They would talk about how, their grandmother was mad or their uncle was mad, or, people would even write, about their fathers or mothers being mad. And it was often quite humorous. Because I suppose the idea, and it's quite true, that one doesn't want to be infected by this. Because if one begins to entertain the possibility that reality is indeed just a construct, things begin slipping away. Sarah's grandmother was a lunatic who was institutionalized. She never knew her. She has pictures of her. And she was a beautiful woman who looked just like Alison Brie, but with the appropriate hair of the time and dress sense of the time. Very elegant looking woman. She was institutionalized for decades. And then when the mental hospitals were closed in the 1980s, she was thrown onto the streets. She became homeless and died on the streets. She never knew her grandfather, who died in the Korean War. Her mother was a depressive, and her mother killed herself with an overdose of pills a year before this movie starts. Now, at first I thought that there's an old movie cliche. You see it in Psycho. You see it in so many other movies where you see water swirling around a drain, that is suggesting futility, and an end to all things. Well, water in this film is a symbol of death. Over and over again, we see it used as a symbol of death. And people associated, for instance, a plumber, a fellow who owns a plumbing business, is incorporated into this as well, perhaps because of his power, the power that he has to harness water. The shower was running when Sarah's mother killed herself. Sarah was the one who found her dead and came upon the shower still going. That Sarah herself having a shower is normally a precursor to some sort of breakdown or manic episode on her part. That Sarah begins to believe that she is out of place, that she is out of time, that she is someone else, a clone. Now, this has been suggested by the show Purgatory. She later believes that she's not an alien clone, but she is a clone of her grandmother, and that these clones serve as human thermometers. Again, all of the sort of thing that normal people just consider to be static in life. Schizophrenics, they weave this all together into this monstrous tapestry. Now, there's people, if you watch the movies of Eric Romer, for instance, he's making his belief, he demonstrates his belief over and over again that there are no coincidences in life. But Romer proceeds from a belief in God, in a belief in a beneficent God overseeing the world, whereas the schizophrenic's world is a world of demonism. And in fact, the movie is rather ambiguous on this because Sarah very clearly appears to be a very fit subject for an exorcism, but we don't. There's no suggestion of this. There's no religious thought of any kind except demonic in this movie. On the date that Sarah has with Darren, and of course Darren shares the name of one of the lead characters on Purgatory, and of course I suppose that it's a problem in a movie such as this is that you begin to think, well, how much of what we are seeing is real? Now, the hallucinations, which engulf Sarah in, say, Act 3 of the film, it's pretty clear that they are hallucinations. In any event, Sarah has a surprise for Darren. First, they go and look inside the kitchen window of a house. There's a Hispanic man sitting there with his wife eating dinner, and he's special because he's one of the men I see in my dreams. Darren is rather put out with this. He'd set himself up for it. He'd been given a shit test, as they say, because Alison Brie had been burbling on about reincarnation and aliens and all that. They call this chick crack, and yes, definitely, I'm sure there's something to it. He's just being polite in the way that men are, or you tell a woman you think that this is nonsense and what you must be stupid for believing in this, then I guess a lot of them are just going to decide they don't want to have anything to do with you anymore. Anyway, he rather pays the price for this because the next stop is a graveyard where Sarah's mother is buried. However, if you see the film scene at the beginning of the film where she is tending the grave of her mother, the camera moves in very slowly, and when you get to the ground immediately in front of her, there's no gravestone. We don't know where her mother is buried, but it's not there because there's no marker there. But in any event, Sarah takes Darren to the graveyard, and he does not want to go into the graveyard at night. Not very many people would, I suspect. I'll tell you a story about that. My foster mother's first husband, who was an engineer, was a strange man. He had 3 children, 2 daughters. The elder children were daughters. And he had a habit of driving around at night with the daughters in the car, and he'd end up at the Fraser View Cemetery in Vancouver, 41st and Fraser. And he'd park, and he'd go to get out of the car, and his daughters would say, Dad, we don't want to go in the graveyard. And he'd say, okay, fine, you can stay in the car. No, we'll go with you. So he would walk along the path in the graveyard, and he would turn to his daughters, and he'd say, do you know what the dead say? They'd say, no, Dad, no. And he said, they say nothing at all. That was a rather cruel thing to do to children. But Darren, understandably, has had enough and is absolutely panicked, almost hysterical himself, because Sarah brandishes a pair of scissors. You see, part of DNA is part of this tapestry as well, because she had been given for a birthday gift. What's it called? DNA and you, or something like that. DNA for you. You send a sample of your saliva in, and they tell you your racial ancestry. And this goes like this for Sarah, because she starts thinking about her own ancestry and how crucial her ancestry is in understanding the person that she's become. So when she saw David Paymer, the eyes, ear, and nose specialist, because she started this habit of bleeding copiously through the nose, and he cauterized inside, and she starts speaking this absolute gibberish, terrifying stuff, and about DNA. And she's got this idea that if she can produce a DNA sample from the corpse of her ancestor, she can prove clone. Okay, actually, it's her mother's grave, clone. And of course, Darren, no, stop waving those scissors at me. And she starts screaming, "You lied to me! Help, help, help!" This sort of stuff. And so he runs to the car and drives away. And so that's it for Darren. And Sarah, she descends very, very quickly after this. Now, she has these dreams, these very vivid dreams in which everything is blindingly white, and she is on the floor, and she seems to be somewhat paralyzed. She shows the doctor, David Paymer, this very large bruise she has on her leg. And later we find out that there's some sort of demons or aliens clawing at the people in this dream, one of whom is the Hispanic fellow who owns the plumbing company, who has become part of her mythology for some reason, perhaps because of water. And there's a younger version, or it's a younger version of herself, the girl who was present when her friend was thrown off the horse and crippled. Although it's kind of ambiguous to me because we see that she's wearing a Sub Pop T-shirt after the Seattle record company that Nirvana was first signed to, and later in the institution, she says that she went to sleep in 1995, at the height of grunge, say, and then she woke up and everyone's different, and I don't know anyone anymore, suggesting that this woman could be, perhaps her mother. But everything comes together in the end, where it is it's all revealed. All of the pieces of this jigsaw or this tapestry, they're all present. One of the hallucinations that she's had is of the ocean, but there's a ramp on the ocean leading to the sky. And she becomes obsessed with this ramp as well, and she makes a costume for herself, which is rather like a sea creature, perhaps to negotiate this water in order to get to the ramp. And where does the ramp lead to? We're not shown where the ramp leads to. She kidnaps the horse, takes him to a golf course, and then she is summoned away. And it's completely ambiguous as to, I suppose it could be she enters into the demon world fully, or she simply commits suicide. It's not clear. I like this movie quite a lot. As I say, the acting is very good in it, and the direction is quite well done. The cinematography is restrained. It looks good visually. It's not a very big budget. But it's a very thought-provoking movie. As I mentioned earlier, if you suffered from mental issues or you fear that you might, I would strongly recommend that you do not watch this movie, because of my firm belief that mental illness is a communicable disease. To the extent that it's didactic, not that it intends to be, again, my message is stay away from the occult. All manifestations of the occult, even things that seem innocent like Ouija boards. No, just stay as far away as possible. This is it's really a bold kind of movie. I don't know that it completely succeeds, again, because this is a very difficult thing to pull off. Because I would think that, I'm thinking of that film, Dead of Night, which I talked about in my old podcast, which is it's an Ealing four-parter with interstitials. It's about a group of people in an English house, middle-class people, and they come to tell scary stories, and their world becomes real, it becomes fully integrated. And the secret to the success of that movie is that you show everything that happens, but in such a way that the viewer begins to fear that he has gone insane. Horse Girl is not up to that very high standard, but I think that it is. I think that it's quite good. and definitely worth seeing with the prominent caveat that I mentioned. Interestingly, Alison Brie, she played a head case on Community. Annie Edison, Annie Adderall. She got addicted. She was chubby, quite heavy in high school, and she got addicted to Adderall, I suppose, to lose weight and also to be able to study more intently. She's very ambitious, and she had a nervous breakdown, which resulted in her running through a plate glass window while screaming, "You're all robots!" So there's an example of serendipity. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Horse Girl. What are we going to be talking about next week on Theater Thursday? Rainer Werner Fassbinder, The Marriage of Maria Braun, from 1979, which is about the Wirtschaftswunder, the West German economic miracle. And on June the 4th, I'm going to be talking about the first 5 episodes of Kieslowski's Decalogue. On June the 11th, another German film, The Lives of Others, which is about the Stasi. And on June the 18th, Bob Fosse's All That Jazz. So let's have a final look at the chat. Kevin, were you ever a CFL fan? I was indeed. I was a very staunch CFL fan since I was a boy. My father worked for a car dealership, which my uncle, he was the principal, and so we supplied cars to the BC Lions. So we got season tickets to the games, and my uncle wasn't interested, so my father got the tickets, and he would take me to the games. Unfortunately, I didn't wear glasses at the time, and I hadn't been diagnosed with myopia, and I'm exceedingly nearsighted, so I could barely see anything that was going on. Still, it was exciting. I was a fan up to about the middle 80s, and what happened then was it had been a Canadian game. Then started importing more and more players from the United States, and it lost its character to me. Also, they tore down or they stopped using Empire Stadium, and the games moved to BC Place. A friend of mine, Phil Smith, we were wondering, why is it such an unpleasant experience being in BC Place? Well, one likes to sit outdoors and watch people play on grass, although they were using artificial turf at Empire Stadium. But it was nice, particularly in the night games, to sit outdoors and watch the football. But my friend Phil Smith said the reason that it's so unpleasant here is the house lights are always turned on. So in effect, it's a giant classroom. So, Civilization games, I have never played them. Okay, so, all right, let's see. Craziness being communicable. I just, that fellow, the talk show host, the late night fellow from Pahrump, Nevada, Art, something or other. He used to have all these people, and they had this on my radio. My radio station carried the show, and people would call in, and Art, the host, he would entertain the idea that reality was in fact a construct, like a foreign construct, right? And I thought, I don't want to listen to this anymore. I do not want to listen to this anymore because it's dangerous, that idea. Because if you really think that, then nothing that you do would be of any consequence. It would be like that movie Groundhog Day. You know that movie Men in Black? It doesn't make sense for the reason that if word got out that the government was erasing people's minds and replacing them with new memories, then everyone would begin to suspect that this had been done to them, and everyone would go crazy. Perhaps that's too much to ask for a shoot-'em-up movie. Best infinite loop schizo movie I've seen is Roman Polanski's The Tenant. No, The Tenant is excellent. No question about that. Of course, Rosemary's Baby. Mia Farrow thinks she's going crazy, and everyone's treating her as if she is crazy. I mean, that is one of the great Gaslight movies, no question. Can schizos really speak languages they'd never learned? Mm, yeah, I don't know. You see, there's some people who are natural actors. You know, when you look at people who claim to have multiple personalities, if if you knew an actor, professional actor, even someone who worked in, say, regional theater, those people would be able to come up with 10 or 20 or 30 different distinct characters, and they'd be able to play them very well. Now, you don't have to be paid to be an actor, and I think that this is, these people have decided to do this. Okay, so that is the show for today. Tomorrow on the book club, I'm going to be speaking about a book which is not about a bad, horrible, demonic things. It's about the joys of the English countryside, the joys of nature and tradition and friendship. And it is called The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Graham. So I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I would be greatly pleased if you would click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not already. If you would like to support this show, and golly, I would really appreciate it if you would, especially, well, this week. My PayPal address is Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. I'll leave you with my now traditional benediction and farewell. In these days of total social atomization, I do dearly hope that all of you, dear listeners, manage to forge some kind of a genuine human connection. Thank you. Good night.